I run a newsletter right now called interplace.io, and it's about the interaction of people in place. And this is really what I call my personal PhD, because when I turned 50, I decided to explore some ideas that I learned and theories when I was getting my degree in sustainable transportation. And there's a lot of issues, just interrelated issues, among many of the things you just mentioned. But the thing that really stood out for me was the intersection of land use policy and transportation policy. Naturally, my degree was focused more on policy around transportation, but they end up being two sides of the same coin. And it's really hard to address one without addressing the other. And so, probably based on my roots as a geography major, as an undergrad there at UC Santa Barbara, I became increasingly fascinated with this issue as traffic got worse and the environment continued to decline. And I was turning 50. I decided after spending half my life in software, I'd probably better do something about trying to do my part to make a change for the better in the world before I leave it. So my writing is really me trying to nudge myself, educate myself a little bit more about what is needed. And by sharing it with the world, hopefully folks can join in the journey and we can start to nudge toward a better world.
I'm curious about this personal activism. One of the things, we like at TEDx is ideas worth doing. We talk about ideas worth sharing, but it's ideas worth doing. And it feels like you took on this master's program and then decided to do this writing project, and you're, the tons and tons and tons of pieces. It's quite impressive. When was it before you were 50 that you got that itch to be an activist, or did you ever see yourself as an activist?
No, not really. I think it was probably a combination of, hitting middle age. That's when you start to look in the rearview mirror a little more often than you do out the window. And the fact that, the planet keeps warming, populations in urban areas continue to explode at an exponential rate. And, a large part of that is rooted in the fact that we are dependent, especially in North America, on the automobile. And, I think for me, the activism really kicked in when, I combined what time I had left on this earth with the fact that it's not getting any better. And so if I could do something, I better start now.
There's a lot of things come to mind, but you had said specifically the abundance of automobiles, not internal combustion automobiles, and you have a point of view that let's future pace to they're all electric. Why is that still bad, even if they're all electric?
Yeah, it's first I should start by saying, like, I'm pro electrification. Like, it's job one is to get us all for sure on renewable electricity as soon as we can. And there's been huge leaps and bounds in that direction, especially with the recent passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, which has really had a ton of climate policy embedded in it that I'm proud to say was driven in large part by some elected officials here in Washington. But I think that in doing so, there's a lot of provisions in there that make it a lot more affordable, ideally, for people to go buy an electric vehicle.
Right.
And that's all well and good for sure with regards to CO2 emissions. But what people often don't stop to think about is, it's still the same sized car. It's going to occupy the same amount of space on our roadways. And as more people enter urban areas and they can't afford a vehicle, it just means that much more traffic on the road. And I would hope we could solve both problems at the same time. And the reality is there's only so much space on our roads for a private vehicle. And the only way we're going to get out of that mess is to reduce the number of cars on the road. And that puts a lot of pressure on the available space that is there, because it's, we have to share what roads we have. There's little appetite for expanding roads, especially in urban areas. And if we want to get to a place where we can still move around, and that's a necessity both for humanity, for existing in our communities, but also for our economies, we're going to have to find alternatives to the car, which is why you see a lot of cities now turning to congestion pricing, limiting or
Is that working,
blocking
by the way? Is the
access.
pricing working?
It is in the select places where there's been enough political leadership to put it into action. It is. I think one of the most shining examples in recent years is in Oslo, where they first started with electing a pretty progressive local government, who then decided to turn their central business district into pedestrian only. And so you can only access that by foot or by bike. And what they find is, property values go up. People want to be downtown more often because it's more pleasant without cars. It does then have fall-on effects, which are also not great. And that if property values go up, now you need to look at affordable housing. Can everybody live in a car-free neighborhood or city? And that's where Paris jumped ahead of that. And when their mayor started to build more bike infrastructure, taking space away from vehicles, they also made sure that they're also building affordable housing so that people weren't priced out of those districts. But then when you look just outside of those rings, and Paris is a good example, it's still very much a car dependent city, right? So we have to be careful not to create these diamonds in the rough of car-free neighborhoods where only affluent people can live. We need to think about this holistically, which is a big part of what I try to write about.
You bring up this other idea, which I hadn't considered. You talk about social isolation. Tell us more about how that fits into this.
Yeah, I think it's another byproduct of auto dependency that we don't give enough thought to. I don't think there's enough conversation about. But when you put yourself in a car, you're putting yourself away from your community members, and a lot of that's intentional. Automobiles are amazing. They're comfortable little cocoons where even if it's the weather outside is not great, you can feel comfortable in your car. For people who have a lot of fear of urban areas, they feel safe alone in their car. And so there's a lot of incentive for people to own a car for those reasons. But the more everybody is isolated from one another, the less likely you are to actually interact with members of your community. And, we're social animals. We evolved to be engaging, not through a two-dimensional Zoom window and not through the windshield of an automobile. In fact, there's studies that show people who drive convertibles often engage pedestrians more, and pedestrians are more likely to engage a motorist if they're in a convertible because the barrier has been dropped.
Right.
But as you see, the trend lately is the opposite direction. It's larger vehicles with tinted windows
that are all windshield.
Yeah, it's all windshield, further distancing themselves from humanity. And for a lot of those occupants, that's what they want. They want to feel comfortable. But you know, if we're going to be moving from place to place alone, to be in a house where we're staring at a screen alone, it's going to lead to a lonely existence. And you know, research is bearing that out. Americans are reporting being more lonely than ever.
Yeah.
It's evident, you know, throughout the developed world. The more car dependent you become, the more isolated you become. And for the baby boomer generation, which is going to be the biggest chunk of aging Americans we've ever seen, it's going to be that much more lonely for them if they're dependent on a car that they can no longer drive. And so, you know, a big part of the education that I got was looking at those alternatives, and you know, providing safe infrastructure for bikes and peds is a big part of that. But people have to remember that bike lanes are for wheelchairs as well.
Mm.
And you know, there are ways to share the space that we have in our cities, both with bikes, peds, but also buses. And you know, eventually, I think as we see more and more cities moving in this direction, I am hopeful that we're going to get there. But it's going to require, I think, everybody being a little more tolerant of the weather, but also the people around them.
You also write about, you say, nudging human behavior, and which just gave me a chuckle, because I know that you know, the sustainability conversations we've been having are around more than nudging human behavior, around
Yeah.
all the things that we can do. And there seems to be the whole environmental issue has become politicized, so that makes it even harder to do what needs to be done. I won't
Yes.
even say the right thing, but just to do the things that we have to do. You also talk about, use the word ethical policy paths, and I was curious to hear your explanation of why you inserted the word ethical.
Yeah, I think you know, a lot of the public space that we do have for mobility is dominated by a single mode, the vehicle. You know, in America, almost all of our cities, especially from the Midwest to the West, have been designed and built with the assumption that you're going to own a car. And so it creates this situation where the public space that we do have for mobility is not equitable. It is, the majority of the space is allocated to the safe pathway of a motor vehicle. And you know, I think both our history, but also our policy that is written in local governments needs to look at that as through an ethical lens. Is it fair that we allocate space that way? And you know, I think what we see with when cities do allocate space, say for cycling, that people start to cycle more. It's true of the automobile, right? You expand a freeway and it invites more people to use the freeway. And when you expand space for alternative modes of transportation, be it bike, walk, or bus, then you start to see a more equitable use of that space. And it's not that radical of a concept. You know, before the automobile, you know, the kids played in the street. The street was the place where you played baseball, where you met with your friends, where you met family and friends. Everybody existed in the street. And oddly enough, it was the bicycle that people became afraid of in the late 1800s until the car displaced that fear. But, you know, I use the word ethical because I think we need to look at public space with an equity lens, and that requires relooking at our policies through an ethical lens.
With the amount of spending that currently is proposed, or not proposed, I mean, it's actually passed, do you think we're going to start seeing these redesigned cities, redesigned city centers? Is that a part of what's happening? I mean, as we have this opportunity now to redo infrastructure. So do you get a sense, and I know those of you that are paying attention to the fine points of the policy are in there in your lobbying and doing the things that need to be done for all of us. And by the way, thank you. How do you see that playing out in the next few years?
Yeah, I think the legislation that passed is, it's federally focused, and a lot of the engines that they're trying to move with that legislation are centered around the big levers of our economy, which still remain to be our auto industry. And so, in the path toward electrification, a lot of that policy at the federal level is geared toward getting those levers to move to electric vehicles. But I think when we're talking about what's happening on the ground, city to city, it's incumbent upon local people and local leaders to set the example for what can happen in a city. And I'm a big believer that if you can solve those problems locally, even at a neighborhood level, that it becomes a contagion. Other people want it. I think we got a taste of that during the pandemic when everything was closing down, people had nowhere to drive to. And so they took to walking and biking again. And, it didn't take long before bike shops ran out of bikes. and that's all driven by a local desire or a local need to have an alternative to the automobile. And again, if you look at the cities around the world who have instituted change, it's come at a local level, and it's through local elected officials who go into that position. They run on the platform of wanting progressive change, and so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to identify who those candidates might be, make sure they get voted, and with it comes the political will to make the changes. I don't see it really coming top down so much at the federal level. It's a big ship to move, but I am hopeful that if we do it locally enough, that it will start to spread throughout cities.
I am so glad that you decided to dedicate your thoughts to working on this and helping more and more people become aware of it. Thank you so much for just helping me understand.